I never wanted to come back to Harlan County. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that hadn't been maintained since my grandmother stopped paying the township 15 years ago. Kudzu had eaten the mailbox. The porch roof sagged on the left side where a poplar had leaned against it through 3 winters. I pulled my mother's borrowed sedan into the grass beside the driveway because the driveway itself had become a creek bed, and I sat there with the engine running, staring at a house I hadn't entered since I was 11 years old. My name is Aaron Blackwell. I was 17. I want to be precise about that because everything that happened in the weeks that followed has been distorted by so many retellings that the truth is almost gone now. I was 17. I was finishing my junior year at Boyd County High School. And I'd been living in my grandmother's house since March. Not out of love, but out of necessity. My mother, Dinah, had lost the apartment in Ashland after her second DU1. My grandmother, Cora Blackwell, had died in January. The house was empty. The house was paid off. And my mother, with the logic of someone who treats consequences as suggestions, decided we would simply move in. We did not move in together. That distinction matters. Dana dropped me at the house with a duffel bag, a prepaid phone with $9 of credit, and a promise to return the following weekend with the rest of our things. That was March 9th. She did not come back on the 15th or the 22nd. She called once on March 28th to tell me she was staying with someone named Gerald in Huntington and that I should enroll myself in the nearest school. I did not enroll myself in the nearest school. I had no transportation, no legal guardian on site, and no interest in explaining my situation to another guidance counselor. Instead, I lived in my dead grandmother's house, alone. I want to be clear about the house because it becomes important. It was a 2-story farmhouse built in 1952 on 11 acres of overgrown pasture backing up against a wooded ridge. The first floor had a kitchen, a front room, a bathroom with no shower, and a back room my grandmother had used as a bedroom after the stairs became difficult. The second floor had 3 bedrooms I never opened, and a hallway that smelled like moth crystals so strongly it burned the eyes. The basement was accessible through a door in the kitchen, and the basement was where my grandmother had kept her canning shelves, her chest freezer. And though I did not know this yet, the sealed steel door behind a false wall of shelving that led into 60 feet of reinforced earth. But I will get to the bunker. In April, the news began doing the thing the news does when it doesn't want to say a true thing plainly. There were reports of a neurological event cluster in Memphis, then Louisville, then Cincinnati, which was close enough that I walked to the gas station 2 miles down Route 11 to watch their television because I had no working TV and my phone was dead. The clerk, a man named Roy, who had been selling me discounted expired bread for 3 weeks, stood behind the counter with his arms folded and his jaw tight. "They're saying it's a prion thing," Roy said. "Like mad cow, but fast." "How fast?" They showed a video out of Memphis. A woman bit a paramedic on the neck, took a piece out of him. He unfolded his arms and refolded them. She'd been declared dead 6 hours earlier. I bought a can of peanut butter and a gallon of water with the last of the cash my mother had left me. "You up at the Blackwell place?" Roy asked. "Yeah." "You up there alone?" I didn't answer. He didn't push. I walked back in the late afternoon light with the peanut butter in my jacket pocket and the water jug in my hand, and I thought about prions in Memphis and the fact that Cincinnati was only 3 hours north of where I was standing. I did not think about zombies. Nobody was saying that word yet. They would, within the week. The first confirmed case in Kentucky was reported on April 11th, a truck driver found at a rest stop near Lexington. unresponsive, then extremely responsive. He had been dead for an estimated 4 hours, according to the coroner's preliminary body temperature reading. Then he sat up on the gurney in the back of the ambulance and tore through the lower lip of an EMT named Cheryl Watkins. The dashcam footage from the state trooper's car made it to Twitter before the CDC could suppress it, and that was the end of the careful language. The news stopped saying neurological event. People started saying the word. I was in my grandmother's kitchen when the internet on my prepaid phone finally loaded the video. I watched it twice. The truck driver's movements were wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, too fast in the arms, too loose in the spine, as though his body had forgotten its own engineering and was improvising. He did not look like a movie zombie. He looked like a man being operated by something that had read the manual but skipped the chapters on coordination. That night, I locked both doors for the first time. The back door had no deadbolt, only a sliding chain that a hard shoulder could snap. The front door had a deadbolt, but the frame was soft with rot. I pushed my grandmother's heavy oak dresser against the back door and slept in the front room on the couch with a canning jar lid in my hand because it was the closest thing to a weapon I could find without going to the basement in the dark. I should tell you about the basement. I had been into it exactly once, on my second day in the house, to check the chest freezer. The freezer was unplugged and empty and smelled like something I chose not to investigate. The canning shelves were still full rows of mason jars containing green beans, tomatoes, apple butter, and things I couldn't identify through the dusty glass. The single bulb overhead worked, but cast a light so yellow and weak it made the space feel smaller than it was. I had noticed, on that single visit, that the far wall looked odd. The shelving unit against it was bolted to the concrete floor rather than simply standing. And behind the jars, if you looked at the right angle, you could see that the wall wasn't poured concrete like the rest. It was a panel, set into a frame. I noticed it, and I did not investigate, because I was 17 and alone in a dead woman's basement, and the smell from the freezer was enough to drive me back upstairs. Now, on April 12th, with Kentucky's first confirmed reanimation on my cracked phone screen, I went back down. The shelving unit was heavy, but not immovable. The bolts were old, and the concrete around them had powdered. I rocked the unit back and forth until 2 bolts snapped, then pulled it sideways enough to see the panel clearly. It was steel, painted to match the wall but unmistakably steel, set into a steel frame with a recessed handle and a rotating latch like something from a ship's bulkhead. I turned the latch. It resisted, then gave with a sound like cracking knuckles. Behind it was a corridor. Concrete floor, concrete walls, maybe 3 feet wide. It descended at a gentle slope for what I later measured as 62 feet before opening into a room. The room was 12 feet by 20. It had a ventilation shaft in the ceiling with a manual crank fan. It had 4 steel frame bunk beds pushed against the walls. It had metal shelving units stocked with canned goods, water containers, medical supplies, and sealed plastic bins, and stacked in the far corner like paperback books, U.S. Army field rations with dates stamped 1987. My grandmother had never mentioned this. My mother had never mentioned this. No one in my family had ever, in any conversation I could recall, mentioned that Cora Blackwell's house in Harlan County sat on top of a Cold War bunker stocked for 8. I stood in the middle of that room, and I turned in a slow circle, and I understood, for the first time since March, that the house had chosen me as much as I had been dumped in it. I spent April 13th cataloging. 17 cases of military rations, each case holding 12 individual meals. 204 meals total, most of them older than I was, but MRS were engineered to outlast the civilization that manufactured them. 48-gallon jugs of water, sealed. A plastic tub containing water purification tablets, iodine, and a hand pump filter still in its original packaging. 3 first aid kits of the comprehensive military surplus variety sutures, hemostatic gauze, SAM splints, burn dressings, tourniquets. A 4th bin held batteries, a hand crank radio, 2 flashlights, a bundle of emergency candles, and a folded paper map of Harlan County with pencil notations in my grandmother's handwriting. I brought the map upstairs and spread it on the kitchen table. Cora had marked water sources, fire roads, the locations of 3 neighboring properties, and a single line in the margin that said, "If the draft comes for your boys, they go below. Tell no one." My grandmother had 2 sons, my Uncle Keith, who died in a mining accident in 1991, and my mother's older brother David, who moved to Oregon in 1984 and never came back. The bunker wasn't built for a pandemic. It was built for Vietnam. It was built by a woman who had watched her husband come back from Korea with half a lung and decided that the government would not take her children the same way. That realization sat in my chest like a stone. My grandmother had spent money she didn't have and labor she couldn't spare to build a hidden shelter for sons who never needed it. And now I, her forgotten granddaughter, the one she hadn't seen in 6 years, the one whose mother couldn't be bothered to call, was standing in it. The guilt came fast, and I pushed it down faster. By afternoon, the news had changed in a way that erased self-reflection. Cincinnati was reporting 47 confirmed reanimations. Louisville had declared a state of emergency. The governor of Kentucky issued a shelter-in-place order that no one understood, because no one had ever sheltered in place against the dead. I walked to Roy's gas station because I needed information more than I needed, to preserve the food in my pockets. The station was crowded. 12 or 15 people from the surrounding hollows had gathered in the small lot. Some in trucks with engines running, some standing in clusters with the tense posture of people who expected to need to move quickly. Roy was outside, which was unusual. He had a pump-action shotgun leaning against the ice machine. "Aaron," he said when he saw me, "you need to not be walking the road alone." "I don't have a car." "I know you don't have a car, that's what I'm saying." A woman I didn't recognize, mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, a surgical mask hanging under her chin, turned to look at me. "You're the girl up at Cora's place?" "Yes, ma'am." "By yourself?" "Yes, ma'am." She exchanged a look with Roy that contained an entire conversation I wasn't invited to. Then she extended her hand. "I'm June Harwood. I live on the next ridge over. Your grandmother and I were in the same quilting circle for 20 years. She paused. "I have my daughter and my 2 nephews at my house, ages 13, 9, and 6. I understood what she was asking before she asked it. "My house is a single story with picture windows," June said. "If this gets here, I can't board that up and keep 3 children safe." Roy cut in. "The Blackwell place is 2 stories, stone foundation, small windows. Best built house in this hollow." He didn't know about the bunker. Nobody did. "You're welcome to come up," I said, and the words came out of my mouth before I had decided to say them. It was reflex, the same reflex that had made me hold open doors and carry groceries for neighbors and say yes, ma'am, to strangers. The politeness of a girl raised to never inconvenience anyone, even when the world was ending. June Harwood nodded once, as if I had confirmed something she already knew. "We'll be there by dark." She was. And with her came the first fracture of everything I thought I understood about what I was willing to do. June arrived at 6:40 in the evening with a pickup truck, 3 children, and more supplies than I expected. Her daughter, Lily, was 13 and had the wary eyes of a child who had already learned that adults made promises they couldn't keep. The nephews, Marcus, 9, and Deshaun, 6, were her sister's boys. June told me her sister, Tamara, was a nurse at Pikeville Medical Center and had not answered her phone in 2 days. She said this once, flatly, and never said it again. I understood that too. We unloaded the truck in the fading light. June had brought sleeping bags, a camp stove, canned food, powdered milk, a jug of bleach, a battery lantern, a .22 rifle, and a box of ammunition. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had already done the math and decided that urgency outranked grief. "Ground rules," she said, standing in my grandmother's kitchen while Marcus and Deshaun explored the front room with the suppressed excitement children use when they're too scared to admit they're scared. "I'm not here to take over your house. I'm here because my house will get us killed. You set the terms." I was 17. She was 44. She had a rifle and a truck and 3 children depending on her. The idea that I would set terms was absurd, and we both knew it. But she said it anyway, and I understood the respect embedded in it. This was my grandmother's house. The invitation had been mine. "The upstairs is empty," I said. 3 bedrooms, pick whichever 2 you want. The kitchen is shared. We ration everything starting now." June nodded. Lily, standing behind her mother, studied me with an expression I later recognized as assessment. She was deciding whether I was competent. She was 13, and she was already triaging the adults around her. That night, with the children asleep upstairs and the doors barricaded, June and I sat at the kitchen table, and I told her about the bunker. She went quiet. Not surprised quiet, calculating quiet. She looked at the basement door for a long time. "Show me," she said. I took her down. She walked the corridor, entered the room, surveyed the supplies, tested the ventilation crank, checked the latch mechanism on the steel door. She counted the bunks. She read the map. "Your grandmother built this?" "Her and my grandfather, I think, during Vietnam." 8 bunks. June touched the frame of the nearest one. "That's tight for 6 people. We're 5. "We're 5 now." She looked at me. "How long do you think that lasts?" I didn't answer because the answer was obvious. Word would spread. People would come. The house was already known as the sturdiest structure in the hollow. And the hollow had maybe 30 residents spread across 6 miles of ridge. Some of them would manage. Some of them would need shelter. And when they came, I would have to decide whether the bunker was a secret or a resource. June read this on my face. "You don't have to decide tonight." "When?" "When someone's standing at the door." She was right, and I resented her for it. The luxury of preemptive ethics belonged to people who had time. I had a sealed room under 60 feet of earth and a world that was teaching me, hour by hour, that survival was not a feeling. It was architecture. We went back upstairs. June locked the basement door behind us and put the key, my grandmother's key, found in a kitchen drawer, on a string around her neck. I opened my mouth to object and closed it. "If something happens to you," she said, "those kids need someone who knows where the safe room is." She was right again. I hated it again. I lay on the couch in the front room that night, listening to the April wind against the window and the distant, arrhythmic sound of something moving on the gravel road. It could have been a deer. It could have been a dog. I told myself it was a dog, and I pressed the canning jar lid against my palm, until the metal edge left a crescent moon in my skin, and I did not sleep until the sound stopped. Roy arrived the next morning, April 14th, in his own truck, and he was not alone. With him were two men I didn't know. Carl Briggs, a retired electrician in his 60s with a white beard and hands that shook slightly until they held a tool. And Nathan Pruitt, 23, thin, tattooed, wearing an army surplus jacket over a frame that had clearly seen harder years than his age suggested. Roy introduced them on the porch while the morning fog was still threading through the trees. "Carl's got nowhere safe," Roy said. "His place is a trailer off Route 11. Nathan's been sleeping in his car behind my station for 2 weeks. 3, Nathan corrected quietly. "I closed the station," Roy continued. "Pumps are dry. Power went out at 2 a.m. and it hasn't come back. Whatever's happening in the cities, it's moving this direction, and I'm not sitting in a glass-front building waiting for it." 8 people now. 3 adults. 1 teenager claiming adulthood. 1 adolescent measuring everyone, and 3 children who deserved none of this. 5 of the 8 bunker beds were already spoken for in my mind, and the math was beginning to press against the walls. I let them in. Carl went straight to work. Within an hour, he had assessed the house's electrical system dead, as expected, and rigged a battery bank from the truck batteries to run a single lantern and the hand-crank radio. He did this without asking permission, without announcing himself, and without speaking more than 6 words total. I liked him immediately. Nathan was harder to read. He helped June move furniture to reinforce the back door. And he did it with the careful precision of someone who had practiced being useful as a survival strategy. He didn't volunteer information. When Deshawn asked him what the tattoo on his forearm said, Nathan knelt down, showed the boy, and said, "It says keep going. That's good advice for today." The tattoo actually said Revelation 21:4. I noticed that later. By noon, the radio was working and the news was no longer news. It was a dirge. Louisville had fallen in the sense that the infrastructure had collapsed, not from zombies overrunning barricades like in the movies, but from systems failing in sequence. The power grid went first. Then water pressure dropped. Then emergency services stopped responding. Then people fled, and the highways became parking lots, and the dead found the living sitting in their cars in neat, gridlocked rows. The description that stayed with me came from a National Guard officer broadcasting on an open frequency. They don't hunt. They wander. But there are so many of them now that wandering is enough. I thought about that for a long time. The infected, I still couldn't say the word, not out loud, not yet didn't need strategy. They needed only density. Enough bodies moving in enough directions would eventually find you the way water eventually finds the crack in a foundation. That afternoon, June and I had our first real disagreement. "We need to tell everyone about the bunker," she said. We were on the back porch, out of earshot. "If we have to move down there fast, everyone needs to know the route. If everyone knows about it, everyone will want to bring more people into it." "That's a problem for later." "Later is tomorrow, June. Roy's already brought 2 strangers. If Carl and Nathan know there's a stocked shelter under this house, they'll tell the next person who shows up, and that person will tell someone else. And by next week, we'll have 20 people standing in a room built for 8. June looked at me with an expression I hadn't earned the expression of a mother recognizing something dangerous in a child who has not yet learned to name it. "Aaron, you're 17. I know how old I am." Then you know that deciding who deserves to be safe is not something a 17-year-old should have to carry. But I'm carrying it anyway. She didn't argue. She went back inside. I stood on the porch in the fog, and I felt something settle into my bones that wasn't fear. It was older than fear. It was the understanding that this house, my grandmother's house, built to protect children from wars, was now mine, in a way that inheritance papers could never formalize. And I was already becoming someone I didn't recognize. The first infected person I saw was Mrs. Calloway. She had lived a mile down the ridge in a yellow house, with a garden that my grandmother had always praised. She was 71, walked with a cane, and had brought my grandmother blackberry cobbler every August for as long as anyone could remember. I knew this because June told me these things as we stood at the upstairs window on the morning of April 16th and watched Mrs. Calloway walk into the front yard. She was not walking correctly. Her cane was gone. Her left arm swung at an angle that suggested the shoulder was dislocated, or the muscles controlling it had forgotten their purpose. She moved in a halting, lurching rhythm, 3 quick steps, a pause, a slow rotation of the head, then 3 more. She was wearing a housecoat and 1 shoe. The other foot was bare and left dark prints on the gravel that I understood, with a sickness that started in my teeth and spread downward, were blood. "Don't let the kids come up here," I said to June. June was already moving. I watched Mrs. Calloway cross the yard toward the porch. She didn't approach the door. She didn't seem to know the door was there. She walked to the porch steps, stood at the bottom, and tilted her head back as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she turned and walked toward the tree line at the same lurching pace and disappeared into the woods. The whole encounter lasted 90 seconds. I stood at the window for 20 minutes after she was gone, my hands flat on the sill, my heartbeat audible in my own skull. When I came downstairs, everyone was in the kitchen. Marcus was eating a granola bar. Deshawn was drawing on the back of an envelope. Lily sat in the corner with her arms around her knees, and her eyes told me she had seen what I had seen from a different window, despite her mother's instruction. "That was Mrs. Calloway," Roy said. He was sitting at the table with a cup of water he hadn't touched. "I've known her since I was a boy." "She's gone, Roy. I know she's gone." His voice cracked on the second word, and he repaired it instantly, the way men of his generation did, patching the wall before anyone could see the damage. "I'm saying I knew her, past tense." Carl, in the corner, said nothing. Nathan, leaning against the counter, said, "How far is the nearest town with a real population?" "Harlan's about 20 miles, Roy said. "Maybe 12,000 people." "Then we have time. These things move on foot. They don't drive. 20 miles of mountain road buys us days, maybe a week." "Unless someone drives them here," I said. "Someone running from Harlan, leading them up into the hollows." The room got quiet. It was June who finally spoke. "We should talk about the basement." I looked at her. She looked back at me with a steadiness that was not apologetic. She had waited for the right moment. Mrs. Calloway was the right moment. The infected were no longer an abstraction on a cracked phone screen. They were in the yard, wearing housecoats, bleeding from their feet. The argument for secrecy had evaporated with Mrs. Calloway's bare footprint on the gravel. "There's a bunker," I said. I said it to the room. "Under the house. My grandmother built it. It stocked for 8 people for approximately 3 months." The silence that followed was not shock. It was recalibration. I watched each person do the math separately. 8 bunks, 8 people. We were already 8. Nathan nodded once, slow. Carl looked at his hands. Roy looked at the basement door and then at me with something that might have been admiration or might have been pity. Lily spoke. 8 exactly? 8 exactly. Then nobody else can come. She said it without inflection, without cruelty, without the defensive posture of someone expecting to be corrected. She said it the way a 13-year-old says a math answer, factual, complete. And I realized, standing in my grandmother's kitchen with the blood on the gravel drying in the April sun, that Lily Harwood was going to be either my greatest ally or my most precise mirror reflecting back every hard thing I was becoming. We showed everyone the bunker on the evening of April 16th. Carl descended the corridor and spent 40 minutes inspecting the ventilation system, the structural joints, the steel door's hinges and latch. He came back up with his first full sentence of the week. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. This will hold. Roy cataloged the food supply with June while I supervised the children's exploration of the space. Marcus and Deshawn treated it like a fort, claiming bunks, testing the springs, asking if they could sleep down there tonight. Lily sat on the bottom bunk nearest the door and ran her fingers along the frame and said nothing. Nathan did something none of us expected. He took the hand crank radio down into the bunker, turned it on, and listened. The reception was poor 60 feet of earth. Will do that, but not absent. He spent an hour adjusting the antenna, routing the wire up through the ventilation shaft. And when he was done, the bunker had a clear signal. Army surplus knowledge? Roy asked. Something like that, Nathan said. We established protocols that night, sitting in the kitchen by lantern light while the children slept upstairs. June led the conversation because June was, by nature and by profession, she had been a county social worker before her department was defunded. The person in the room most practiced at managing groups of frightened people. Bunker protocol. If the house was breached, everyone descended. Last person sealed the steel door. The corridor was narrow enough that the shelving unit, pulled back into place, would obscure the entrance from anything that didn't know to look for it. Resource protocol, all food pooled. Rationing began immediately. 2 meals per day, children receiving larger portions. Water from the jugs first, then boiled creek water from the stream 200 yards behind the house. Watch protocol. 2-person shifts, 4 hours each, day and night. Upstairs windows provided sight lines on the road, the yard, and the tree line. Roy and Nathan took the first shift. Carl and I would take the second. Security protocol, Roy's shotgun and June's .22 were the only firearms. Roy kept the shotgun. June kept the rifle. Nathan asked if there were additional weapons. There were not. Carl found a hatchet in the back room and a set of heavy garden tools in a shed behind the house. Nathan took the hatchet without being offered it, and June watched this happen with an expression I filed away. One more thing, I said when the protocols were settled. Nobody goes beyond the tree line alone. Nobody goes to the road alone. If someone approaches the house, we assess from upstairs before opening any door. And if someone approaches the house and needs help, June asked, we assess. That's not an answer. It's the answer for tonight. June accepted this. The table accepted this. But I could feel the fault line beneath the agreement, the place where my instinct to restrict and June's instinct to include would eventually fracture the ground between us. I took the second watch with Carl from midnight to 4. We sat in the upstairs hallway between 2 open bedroom doors, each with a view of a different exposure of the property. Carl sat in a wooden chair he'd carried up from the kitchen. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall. At 1:15, Carl said, "Your grandmother was a hard woman." I didn't know her well. She was hard, and she was good. Those two things lived in the same house in her the way they live in this house now. He paused. She built that shelter because she loved her boys enough to break the law. You know she poured that concrete herself? Her and your grandfather, weekends for 2 years. County never knew. How do you know? Because I helped with the electrical. I ran the ventilation fan wiring in 1971. He looked at me in the lantern light, and his shaking hands were still. I've known about that bunker for 55 years, Aaron, and I never told a living soul. I stared at him. Your grandmother asked me not to, so I didn't. That was the moment I understood that the house was not just a shelter. It was a kept promise, passed from one generation's stubbornness to the next. April 17th brought the Maddox family. They came on foot. Tom Maddox, his wife Sheila, and their son Braden, who was 16. They came up the gravel road at mid-morning, carrying backpacks, moving fast, checking behind them in the way that people check behind them when they have recently had reason to run. Roy spotted them from the upstairs window and called down. I went to the porch. Tom Maddox was a large man, breathing hard, sweat darkening his shirt despite the cool air. Sheila had a bruise on her left cheekbone that was new enough to be swelling. Braden stood behind both of them with a baseball bat held across his body and eyes that were not a 16-year-old's eyes anymore. They had aged past his face. We were on Route 11, Tom said. Our truck died 2 miles back. There's a group of them on the road near the bridge. 8, maybe 10. They're slow, but they're bunched up and they're between us and everything north. How long ago? Hour, maybe less. I looked at June, who had come to the doorway. She looked back at me. The conversation we'd had the night before hung between us like a held breath. Come inside, I said. 11 people, 8 bunks. The math was already broken. Tom and Sheila sat in the kitchen and drank water and told us what they'd seen. They lived in a trailer park off Route 11, about 4 miles south. The infection had reached their area overnight. Their neighbor, a man named Dennis, had died of what seemed like a heart attack 2 days prior. His wife had not reported it. Dennis reanimated in his own living room and bit his wife, who reanimated 4 hours later, and by the time the Maddox family understood what was happening, 3 more trailers were compromised. It's not fast like the movies, Sheila said. She was pressing a bag of frozen peas, thawed peas. Really, the freezer had been dead for days against her cheek. It's not a wave, it's a leak. 1 here, 1 there. And then you look around, and there are 6 of them, and they're everywhere and nowhere, and you don't know which direction is safe. Braden hadn't spoken. He sat with the baseball bat across his knees, and when Deshaun approached him with the curiosity of a 6-year-old, Braden looked at the boy, and something in his face softened for exactly 1 second before hardening again. I took June aside in the back room. 11, I said. I can count. 8 bunks. 3 months of food for 8. If we stretch it for 11, we lose weeks. If someone else comes, someone else will come. Then what? June sat on the edge of my grandmother's old bed and rubbed her temples. I don't know. But I'm not going to stand on a porch and tell a man with a bleeding wife and a teenager with a bat that we're full. I'm not saying that. You're building toward it. She wasn't wrong. I was building toward it the way my grandmother had built the bunkers, slowly, deliberately, with a blueprint that prioritized the people already inside. I could feel the architecture of it forming in my thinking, the walls going up, the door narrowing. I let them in, I said. I'm letting everyone in. For now. For now. That for now hung in the air between us like the smell of something burning in a distant room present, growing and impossible to ignore once you'd noticed it. Nathan was the one who reorganized the sleeping arrangements. He moved with a quiet authority that the group accepted without discussion. Adults would rotate between the bunker and the house. Children would sleep in the bunker permanently. Tom's family would take the third upstairs bedroom. It worked on paper. It worked in practice for exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, the Harlan refugees arrived. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because between the Maddox arrival and the Harlan refugees, something happened that changed the internal landscape of our group more than any external threat had managed to. Lily Harwood found my grandmother's journals. The journals were in a metal lockbox under the bottom bunk in the bunker the bunk Lily had claimed. She found them because she was 13 and methodical, and because she had been running her hands along every surface in the room since the first night, memorizing it the way you memorize a lifeboat. The lockbox wasn't locked. It held 3 composition notebooks with marbled covers, filled with my grandmother's handwriting. Lily brought them to me without reading them. I want to record that because it says something about who she was. She could have read them privately. She chose not to. She handed them to me in the kitchen and said, "These were under my bed. They're yours." I read them that night during my watch shift. Carl sat beside me in his chair and did not ask what I was reading, and I did not offer. The first notebook was practical construction notes for the bunker. Measurements, material lists, cost calculations, a hand-drawn floor plan. My grandmother had spent $4,200 in 1969 dollars, most of it on concrete and steel. She recorded each weekend of work with the precision of an accountant. March 15th, poured east wall. March 22nd, set ventilation frame. Carl wired the fan housing. Carl's name appeared 7 times. He was the only other name in the book. The second notebook was a supply inventory, updated annually. Every can, every jug, every ration pack, logged with a date. The last entry was 2008, the year my grandmother's husband died. After that, the pages were blank. She had maintained the bunker for 39 years and stopped the day she lost the person she'd built it with. The third notebook was different. It was not a ledger. It was a letter. A single, continuous letter addressed to whoever finds this room when it's needed. It was written in 2009, the year after the inventory stopped. And it was the most precise and devastating document I have ever read. My grandmother wrote about her reasoning. She wrote about the Korean War and what it did to her husband. She wrote about the draft and the terror of watching her sons approach the age when the government could claim their bodies. She wrote about the decision to build not as preparedness, but as refusal. "I will not give them my boys. I will put them in the ground myself before I let the ground take them." Then she wrote about the moral architecture of the shelter itself. "This room holds 8. I chose 8 because that is what I could feed for 90 days. Not 12, not 20, 8. If you are reading this, you have found this room because you need it, and you will soon face the question I faced when I drew these plans. Who fits inside the number you chose, and what do you do with the ones who don't? I do not have an answer. I built walls because walls were what I could build. But a wall is a decision made in advance. And every decision made in advance is a decision made without knowing the face of the person standing on the other side. Be careful with this room. It will save you, and it will test you. And the test will not be whether you survive. The test will be who you become in order to survive. That is the only inheritance I have left to give." I closed the notebook. Carl was asleep in his chair, his chin on his chest, the hatchet across his lap. Through the window, the property was dark and still, and the moon threw silver across the overgrown pasture, and for a moment, the world looked like it had always looked, like a place where an old woman might grow blackberries and keep bees and build a hidden room under her house, because love made her frightened and fear made her practical. I put the notebook in the lockbox. I put the lockbox under the bunk. I did not show the letter to June or to anyone else. Not because it was private, because it was a mirror, and I was not ready to see what it reflected. The Harlan refugees arrived on April 21st, 5 days after the Maddox family, 9 days after I'd opened the bunker door for the first time. There were 7 of them. They came in 2 vehicles, a minivan and a sedan, packed with people and almost nothing else. They had left Harlan in a hurry. The group included 2 families, the Ramseys and the Turners, plus a man named Glenn, who had been a stranger to both families until 3 days ago when he helped push a stalled car off the road so their vehicles could pass. The minivan pulled into the grass. The sedan pulled in behind it. 18 people now stood inside or around my grandmother's property. And I stood on the porch with the weight of Cora Blackwell's letter pressing against the inside of my ribs like a second heartbeat. June came out beside me. Roy flanked the other side. Janet Ramsey, the driver of the minivan, did the talking. She was maybe 50, gray-streaked hair, voice steady but thin, like a wire pulled taut. She told us Harlan was gone, not overrun, evacuated, badly. The National Guard had set up a checkpoint on Route 421 and tried to funnel the entire town south toward the Tennessee border. The checkpoint collapsed when 3 infected were discovered in the evacuation line itself. Gunfire, stampede, vehicles abandoned on the highway. We turned around, Janet said. We went north into the mountains because there was nowhere else. Her husband, Bill, stood behind her with 2 children, a boy of maybe 10 and a girl of 8. The Turner family was a young couple, Mike and Angela, with a baby. The baby was asleep. Glenn stood apart from both families, arms crossed, watching our house with the analytical gaze of someone assessing structural integrity. "How many are you?" Janet asked. 11, I said. "Can you take 7 more?" I felt June shift beside me. I felt Roy's hand settle on the porch railing. The sun was high and warm, and the mountains were green and beautiful, and I was 17 years old, standing on a porch, being asked to perform a calculation that should have belonged to someone with more authority and less fear. "We can take you in the house," I said. "The house has room." The bunker had no room. I did not mention the bunker. June's head turned toward me, a small, sharp movement. She knew what I had done. I had drawn the line she'd predicted I would draw, and I had drawn it exactly where my grandmother had drawn it before me. At the steel door, between the people who knew the room existed and the people who didn't. The Harlan families moved in. The house became a compression. 18 people in a 2-story farmhouse meant sleeping in shifts, meant bodies in every room, meant the sound of a baby crying at 3 a.m. while Marcus and Deshawn tried to sleep on the floor of the front room. It meant the smell of too many humans in a space with no running water and a single bathroom. It meant the particular tension of strangers learning each other's rhythms, while the world outside the windows grew less navigable by the hour. Glenn was the problem. Not because he was dangerous, I never believed that. Because he was observant. On his first evening, he walked the perimeter of the house, checked the foundation, tested the windows. On his second morning, he went to the basement door, found it locked, and asked me where the key was. "Storage," I said. "It's not safe. The stairs are rotted." I'm an engineer. I can assess that. I'd rather you didn't. He looked at me, really looked, with the full weight of adult attention directed at a teenager who was transparently lying, and he nodded once, slowly, and walked away. He did not ask again. But he watched the basement door. He watched who went near it. He watched the pattern of June and me descending during watch changes to check the water heater. He was assembling the picture without any pieces being offered. Glenn would break the silence within the week. I knew it. I was already preparing for it. The infected reached the Hollow on April 23rd. Not Mrs. Calloway's lone, lurching visit that had been a scout without a mission, a single broken body wandering its old territory. This was different. Nathan, on morning watch, counted 9 figures moving along the tree line at the edge of the property. They emerged from the woods in ones and twos, not together, not coordinated, but all moving generally downhill toward the road, as if drawn by the geography itself. Water follows the lowest path. So it turned out, did the dead. Nathan woke me with a hand on my shoulder and a single word. Look. I went to the window. The morning was gray and cool. The 9 figures were spread across a 200-yard stretch of the tree line, moving at different speeds. Some were fresh, their clothes intact, their movements almost passable as human from a distance. Others were older, more degraded. One was missing an arm below the elbow, and the wound had not bled because there was no circulation to produce bleeding. They came from the Harlan direction, Nathan said. Following the road, probably. Drifted into the trees when the terrain pushed them. Will they keep going? Maybe, if nothing draws their attention. We established silence protocol. No voices above a whisper, no doors opened, no one on the porch. The children were moved to the bunker with June and Sheila. Though neither family from Harlan was told where the children were going, June told Janet Ramsey that there was a root cellar, technically true, and that the children would be safer there. Janet accepted this without question because her own children were terrified, and any offer of deeper shelter was a gift she wasn't going to interrogate. The 9 figures drifted through the property over the course of 3 hours. They moved among the overgrown pasture like broken deer, pausing, swaying, resuming. 2 came within 30 feet of the house. One pressed its face against the first-floor window of the back room, and through the glass I could see that its eyes were open but clouded, like cataracts, and its mouth was working in a repetitive chewing motion even though there was nothing between its teeth. Tom Maddox, crouched beside me, whispered, "They see movement and hear sharp sounds. That's it. From what I've watched, they don't smell, they don't think, they don't plan. They're just running on a bad signal." How do you know? Because I watched Dennis kill his wife. And then I watched Dennis stand in his living room for 40 minutes, doing nothing until his dog barked. Then he went for the dog. The figure at the window stayed for 7 minutes. Then it turned and followed the others downhill. And within an hour, the property was clear. But the damage was internal. The Harlan families had seen the infected up close for the first time. Angela Turner was shaking so badly that her husband couldn't calm her. And the baby picked up the frequency of its mother's fear and screamed in a way that forced Roy to physically cover its mouth while making eye contact with Angela, to communicate that he was sorry, that he knew, that the sound could kill all of them. That moment, Roy's hand over a baby's mouth. Angela's eyes wide with something past terror and into the territory of rage, was the first real fracture. Afterward, Mike Turner stood in the kitchen and said, "You have a root cellar deep enough to hide children, but the rest of us are up here with glass windows. Explain that." "The cellar is small," I said. "How small?" "Too small for everyone." "Then why are some people down there and not others?" Glenn, leaning in the doorway, said nothing. But he was listening. He was always listening. June intercepted. The children went first because they're children. If there's room for more, we'll rotate. But right now, the priority is quiet, and the priority is staying invisible. Mike accepted this because June's voice carried the practiced authority of a woman who had spent decades talking people out of crises. But the question had been planted. The house now contained people who knew they were on the wrong side of a division they couldn't fully see. Glenn confronted me on April 25th. He waited until the house was at its most chaotic, the baby crying, the Ramsey children arguing over a coloring book, June managing a water boiling schedule, and found me alone at the back of the house near the shed. "There's a fortified shelter under this house," he said. No preamble, no accusation, just the sentence, delivered like a structural assessment. "What makes you say that?" "Because I spent 30 years designing load-bearing systems. The foundation of this house has a secondary footprint that extends north beyond the visible structure. The basement floor has a different resonance in the northeast corner. I can feel it through my boots. And you and June disappear downstairs twice a day for periods inconsistent with checking a water heater that isn't connected to anything." I said nothing. "I'm not angry," Glenn said. "I'm telling you I know so we can stop pretending." "How many does it hold?" 8. "How many know about it?" "The original 11. He nodded. He looked at the tree line, at the mountains beyond, at the sky that was perfectly blue and perfectly indifferent to what was happening beneath it. "The Turners have a baby. If those things come back in numbers, the house won't hold. The windows are single pane. The doors are wood. You know this. I know this. Then you know that shelter isn't just for the people who got here first." The argument that rose in my throat was my grandmother's argument, the one from the notebook. "This room holds 8. I chose 8 because that is what I could feed for 90 days. The math was right. The math had always been right. But Glenn was not challenging the math. He was challenging the premise that math was the correct framework for deciding who survived. "If I open that shelter to everyone," I said, "we run out of food in 6 weeks instead of 12. We run out of water faster. The ventilation system was designed for 8. 18 people breathing in a 12 by 20 room will deplete the air. I can modify the ventilation. Give me Carl in 8 hours. And the food? That's a harder problem. But it's a solvable problem if you stop treating the bunker as a vault and start treating it as a tool." I wanted to dismiss him. I wanted the clarity of my grandmother's blueprint, the clean lines, the precise calculations, the certainty that comes from building walls to the exact specifications of what you can protect. But Glenn was right in the way that engineers are right, in the way that my grandmother was right before she wrote the letter that contradicted her own plans. The room existed to save people. The question was whether people meant the ones I had chosen or the ones who needed it. "I'll talk to June," I said. "You don't need June's permission. I need her partnership." He accepted that distinction. We went inside separately. That night, June and I sat in the bunker with the steel door closed and the children asleep on the bunks, and we had the conversation that the entire preceding week had been building toward. "We tell everyone," I said. "What changed?" "Glenn figured it out, and he's right. If they come back in force, the house is paper." "And the food?" "We ration harder. We send supply runs. The gas station might still have stock in the back. The houses down the ridge, Mrs. Calloway's. Others, they're abandoned. There's food in those kitchens." June was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that rearranged everything I thought I understood about our dynamic. "I wasn't pushing you to open the bunker because I'm generous, Aaron. I was pushing you because I watched what keeping secrets did to my mother. She hid money from my father for 20 years. She hid bruises from us for longer. Secrets inside a family become the architecture of the family. And this group is a family now, whether we designed it that way or not." She touched the wall of the bunker. "Your grandmother built this out of love. Don't let it become something else." I told everyone the next morning. The revelation of the bunker changed the group the way a revealed foundation changes a building. Everything above it suddenly made more sense, and less. The Ramseys accepted the news with a quiet that bordered on coldness. Janet looked at me, and I could see her recalculating every interaction we'd had, every reassurance I'd offered about the root cellar, every careful deflection. Bill Ramsey said, "So you've been sitting on a stocked shelter while we slept upstairs with glass windows." I could not argue with the framing because it was accurate. Mike Turner was louder. He stood in the kitchen and spoke with the volume of someone who had spent 3 days terrified for his baby and had just learned that a concrete fortress existed 15 feet below where he'd been lying awake. "You chose who got to be safe. A 17-year-old kid chose who lived and who was expendable." "Nobody was expendable," I said. "Then why weren't we told?" "Because the room holds 8, and there are 18 of us, and I didn't know how to solve that." "So you solved it by not solving it." That landed. It landed because it was true. I had treated the dilemma as unsolvable to avoid solving it. And in doing so, I had made a choice by omission. The 11 who knew were protected, and the 7 who didn't were not. And the only thing separating them was the order of their arrival. Glenn stepped in before the conversation could ignite further. He presented his ventilation plan, expanding the manual crank system with additional ductwork salvaged from the house's heating system, creating a passive airflow loop that could sustain more bodies for longer periods. Carl confirmed the feasibility. Together, they proposed a hybrid model. The bunker as emergency shelter for everyone. The house as daily living space. The transition triggered by threat proximity rather than hierarchy. It was a good plan. It was a better plan than anything I had conceived. And it came from the people I had excluded, which was itself a lesson I was not old enough to articulate, but old enough to feel. The modification work began that afternoon. Carl and Glenn descended into the bunker with tools and a clear-eyed focus that reminded me that purpose is the most effective antidote to fear. Nathan and Tom stripped ductwork from the upstairs bedrooms. Roy organized the able-bodied for a supply run, the first venture beyond the property since the Harlan refugees had arrived. The supply team was Roy, Nathan, Tom, and Braden. Braden insisted. His mother objected. His father overruled her, which created a wound between Sheila and Tom that I could see forming in real time, the way you can see a crack spread through glass before the pane falls. They left at dawn on April 27th with Roy's truck and a list. The gas station, Mrs. Calloway's house, 2 other properties on the road that appeared abandoned. They were to take food, water, batteries, tools, and medical supplies. They were to avoid contact with anyone living or dead. They were to return before noon. They returned at 11:40 with the truck bed full and Nathan's left hand wrapped in a blood-soaked shirt. The cut was on his palm, deep, ragged, from a broken window at Mrs. Calloway's house. Not a bite, not an infection vector. But the sight of blood on a returning party member sent a shock through the group that was disproportionate to the injury and perfectly proportionate to the fear. Angela Turner pulled her baby against her chest and backed into the corner. Janet Ramsey positioned herself between the door and her children. Even June's hand went to the stock of her, 22 before she consciously lowered it. Nathan saw all of this. He unwrapped the shirt, held up his cut palm, and said, "Glass, just glass. Anyone want to check?" Nobody moved. The accusation in the stillness was worse than any words. "I'll check," Lily said. She walked across the room, took Nathan's hand, examined the wound, and began cleaning it with supplies from the first aid kit. She was 13, and her hands were steadier than anyone else's in the room. Trust, I learned, doesn't break with a single impact. It frays, and once frayed, every subsequent stress finds the same weakened thread. The supply runs became routine over the next 10 days. Twice more, Roy's team went out, expanding their radius, hitting houses further along the ridge. They brought back enough canned food and bottled water to extend our timeline by 3 weeks. They brought back blankets, clothing, a second rifle from a gun cabinet in an unlocked farmhouse, and from a house whose owners had clearly fled in a vehicle, a collection of children's books that Marcus and Deshawn treated like treasure. The infected were present, but not pressing. We saw them daily now, ones and twos along the tree line, occasionally in the open pasture. They moved through the property like weather, without purpose, without destination. Nathan's observation held. They responded to movement and sharp sound, nothing else. We adapted. We moved slowly when outside. We spoke in low tones. We closed doors with both hands instead of letting them swing. The children adapted fastest. Marcus developed a game he called Statue, freezing mid-motion whenever an infected was visible from a window, holding the pose until it passed. Deshawn copied everything Marcus did. Lily did not play the game. She watched the infected with a steady, cataloging focus that was not fear and not fascination, but something in between the look of someone building a database. On May 2nd, Lily came to me during the evening watch and said, "They're slower." "What?" "The ones we've been seeing. I've been timing them. When Mrs. Calloway came through on the 16th, she was covering about 1 meter per second during her fast bursts. The ones we're seeing now are averaging 0.6. Some are below 0.4. She paused. "They're degrading." I looked at her. "How are you measuring this?" "I marked 2 points on the fence line. I count the seconds it takes them to cross from one to the other. I've done it 41 times with different subjects. 41 observations, recorded presumably somewhere. A 13-year-old girl conducting a longitudinal study of zombie locomotion from an upstairs window in rural Kentucky. Have you told your mom? My mom would tell me to stop watching them. She'd be right. She'd be right about the watching. She'd be wrong about the data. Lily's data became our first piece of strategic intelligence. Over the following week, I asked others to observe and confirm. Nathan corroborated from his watch shifts the infected were not just slower, they were less responsive. Stimuli that would have drawn them from 100 yards in mid-April now required 50, then 30. Their chewing reflex was less constant. Their movements more hesitant, more interrupted by long pauses of absolute stillness. "They're dying," Carl said, with the flatness of a man who understood material degradation. Whatever's running them is burning through the body. Muscle tissue, neural pathways. They're consuming themselves. "How long?" Roy asked. "Can't say, but the trajectory is clear." This information moved through the group differently depending on who received it. For the Ramseys and Turners, it was hoped the first data point suggesting an end, rather than an indefinite siege. For June, it was a planning variable if the threat had a lifespan. Rationing calculations changed. For Nathan, It was tactical. He began advocating for a wait and observe strategy, minimizing risk, riding out the degradation curve. For me, it was something else. It was the first time the bunker's purpose became finite. If the infected were degrading, the shelter was not a permanent home. It was a bridge, and bridges have two ends. The question of what waited on the far side was one nobody was asking yet. Glenn asked it first. "When they're gone," he said, sitting on the porch on the evening of May 5th, speaking to no one and everyone. "What do we go back to? The infrastructure's collapsed. The cities are empty or dangerous. The government, if it still exists, isn't here." Nobody answered. "This hollow," Glenn continued, "these mountains, this might not be a shelter we're waiting in. This might be where we live now." The word live, not survive. Live landed in the group like a seed in cracked soil. Something shifted. Something took root. On May 7th, a woman walked up the driveway carrying a child who was not moving. Her name was Denise. The child was her daughter, 4 years old, named Sophie. Sophie was not dead, and she was not infected. She was dehydrated to the point of unconsciousness, her lips cracked, her skin papery, her small body limp in her mother's arms, with the terrible looseness of a child who has stopped fighting. Denise had walked from somewhere south, she couldn't say where exactly. The geography had blurred into a continuous ribbon of road and woods and hiding. She had been walking for 3 days. She had no supplies. She had no weapon. She had nothing except Sophie and the biological imperative that had kept her legs moving long past the point where her own body had begun shutting down. June met her at the porch and took the child from her arms and carried Sophie inside without asking anyone's permission, without checking with me, without consulting the group. She laid Sophie on the kitchen table and began rehydration, small sips of water, a solution of sugar and salt, wet cloths on the forehead and wrists. Angela Turner, who had been a dental hygienist and had exactly enough medical knowledge to be useful and terrified, assisted. Denise sat on the floor inside the front door and stared at nothing. I knelt beside her and gave her water. And she drank without acknowledging me, without seeing me, without being present in anything except the animal sense of liquid entering her body. "Is anyone following you?" I asked. She shook her head. "Were you bitten? Was Sophie bitten?" She shook her head again. And then she began crying in the way that people cry when the tears are not new, but have been held back so long that releasing them is a full-body event, a systemic collapse. She cried silently. That was the worst part. She had learned not to make noise. 20 people. Nathan found me on the back porch afterward. He stood beside me and we watched the tree line, and he said, "We need to talk about carrying capacity." "Not now, Aaron. Every person who walks up that road is another mouth and another risk. We don't have infinite food. We don't have infinite water. And we don't have any way to verify that someone walking in isn't carrying the infection in a pre-symptomatic stage. There's no evidence of a pre-symptomatic stage. You die, you reanimate. There's no in-between. There's no evidence because there's no testing. We don't know what we don't know." He was making the argument I had made 3 weeks ago. He was building the wall I had started to build before June and Glenn had torn it down. And hearing it from someone else, hearing my own logic reflected back in Nathan's careful, measured voice, I understood for the first time why June had pushed so hard against it. The argument was sound. The argument was reasonable. And the argument, followed to its conclusion, ended with a 4-year-old girl dying on a road because the number didn't fit. "Sophie stays," I said. "Denise stays." I'm not saying they don't. I'm saying we need a policy. The policy is that people stay. And when the food runs out, then we find more food. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You sound like your grandmother." He meant it as a compliment, maybe, or as an observation. I received it as a weight, because I had read my grandmother's letter, and I knew that she had faced this exact calculation, and she had built the bunker to the number she could sustain, and she had written, in her own hand, that she did not have the answer. The difference between Cora Blackwell and me was that she had built her walls in peacetime, with the luxury of abstraction. I was building mine in real time, with real faces, and the faces kept arriving. Sophie regained consciousness at 10 p.m. Her first word was "Mama." Her second word was "water." June heated broth on the camp stove and fed it to her with a spoon, and Denise held her daughter's hand and did not let go for the next 14 hours. That night, I dreamed about the steel door. In the dream, it was closing, and I was on the wrong side. May passed in a rhythm that oscillated between productive calm and sudden, compressive terror. The infected continued to degrade. Lily's data, now supplemented by Nathan's observations and Roy's binocular surveys, showed a consistent decline. By mid-May, the infected we encountered were barely mobile. Some had stopped moving entirely, standing in fields or against trees in a posture of frozen interruption, as though someone had paused a video of a body mid-step. Their responsiveness to stimuli had dropped to near zero. Nathan walked within 15 feet of a stationary figure on a supply run, and it did not react. Its eyes tracked nothing. Its jaw had stopped its chewing motion. It stood in the weeds, like a scarecrow someone had forgotten to tear down. Weeks, Carl estimated. Maybe less. Whatever metabolic process is driving them is cannibalizing the host tissue. The muscles are visibly atrophied. They can't sustain locomotion on what's left. This should have been cause for celebration. It was. In the children's quarters, Marcus and Deshawn were told that the sick people were getting less dangerous, and they received this news with the resilient optimism of children who need permission to stop being afraid. For the adults, the degradation created a different kind of tension, the tension of transition. If the immediate threat was expiring, what came next? Glenn's observation from the porch, "This might be where we live now," had evolved from a comment into a planning framework. He and Carl had begun assessing the property's long-term viability. 11 acres of overgrown pasture could be cleared and planted. The creek provided year-round water with proper filtration. The woods offered fuel and building material. The bunker could be repurposed as storage once the emergency function was no longer needed. "This isn't a farm," Roy said during one of these discussions. "It could be," Glenn replied. "None of us are farmers. None of us were survivalists 3 weeks ago." The argument carried because the alternative, leaving, heading somewhere else, assuming that organized civilization would reassemble in time to catch them, was not an argument anyone could credibly make. The radios carried nothing but static now. The last broadcast we'd received, on May 10th, was a looped FEMA recording advising citizens to remain in their homes and await further instructions. The recording had been playing for a week with no updates. The government was either destroyed or so diminished that it could not do more than press play on a machine somewhere and walk away. We began the work of conversion. Tom and Braden cleared the nearest acre of pasture, cutting back the overgrowth with hand tools, turning the soil with shovels from the shed. It was brutal, inefficient labor, the kind of work that machines had replaced generations ago. But it occupied their bodies and quieted their minds, and gave them a purpose that was not defensive. Sheila organized a seed search on the next supply run, and the team returned with garden seed packets from 3 different houses: beans, tomatoes, squash, corn. A beginning. June restructured the rationing system around a longer timeline. With the additional supplies from the runs and the prospect of a garden producing within 8 to 10 weeks, she calculated that 20 people could sustain themselves if they accepted hunger as a background condition rather than a crisis. This was not comfort. This was not plenty. This was the mathematics of persistence enough to keep bodies functioning, not enough to keep anyone satisfied. Denise recovered enough to contribute. Turned out to have been a veterinary technician. This was more useful than any of us could have predicted. She understood animal biology, wound care, infection control, and critically, she could identify edible plants with confidence. Within a week, she had mapped a half-mile radius of the property and identified wild onion, chickweed, dandelion, wood sorrel, and black walnut trees with harvestable nuts still on the ground from the previous autumn. The hollow, which had been a trap, began to feel like a territory. The mountains, which had been walls, began to feel like ramparts. The house, which had been a shelter, began to feel like the first structure of something that did not yet have a name. But it would. In time, it would. The last crisis came on May 19th, and it came from inside. Braden Maddox, 16, had been doing the work of a grown man for 3 weeks, clearing land, hauling supplies, standing watch shifts that his father should not have allowed, but did because Tom Maddox needed his son functional more than he needed him protected. Braden carried the bat everywhere. He slept with it. He held it during meals. It had become an extension of his body, a prosthetic for the security he'd lost. On the morning of the 19th, Braden went to the basement alone. He went to the bunker. He sealed the steel door from inside. June discovered this when she descended for the morning supply check and found the corridor blocked. The latch turned, the door immovable from the outside. She came upstairs and told me, and I felt something cold move through my chest. Not fear of Braden, but fear of what the sealed door represented. Tom went down. He knocked. He called his son's name. Through the steel muffled Braden's voice, "I just need to be in here. I'm not hurting anything. I just need to be in here." "Open the door, Braden." "No." Tom looked at me. I saw the fracture in him, the place where fatherhood met helplessness, and the two ground against each other like tectonic plates. "Let me try," Lily said. She had followed us down without being invited. She stood in the narrow corridor, 13 years old, hair tied back, and she looked at Tom and at me with an expression that was not asking permission. She was informing us. Tom stepped back. I stepped back. Lily sat down on the concrete floor outside the steel door. She pressed her back against it. She did not knock. She did not call Braden's name. She sat. After 4 minutes, Braden said, "What are you doing?" "Sitting." "Why?" "Because you're in there, and I'm out here, and someone should be in between." Silence. Then, "I can't come out yet." "Okay. I'm not crazy." "I didn't say you were." "My dad thinks I'm losing it." "Your dad's scared. Scared and crazy look the same from the outside." More silence. I stood in the corridor, motionless, watching a 13-year-old girl perform an act of emotional engineering more sophisticated than anything I had managed in 5 weeks of leadership. She didn't persuade. She didn't comfort. She witnessed. She made herself present on the other side of a door, and she waited. 22 minutes later, the latch turned. Braden opened the door. His eyes were red. His jaw was tight. He looked at Lily and she looked at him, and something passed between them that I had no right to name and no desire to interrupt. Braden came upstairs. He ate lunch. He went back to clearing the pasture. He did not carry the bat. That evening, I found Lily on the porch. "How did you know that would work?" I asked. "I didn't know it would work. I just knew that talking through a locked door doesn't work because I've done it. My mom used to lock herself in the bathroom when she was overwhelmed. I used to sit outside it. She always came out." "You shouldn't have had to do that." "Lots of things shouldn't be. They are anyway." She was 13. She was the most perceptive person in the house. And she was carrying a weight that no data collection or locomotion study could fully express, the weight of a child who has been the emotional custodian of adults for so long that she has forgotten that the job was never supposed to be hers. I sat beside her. We watched the evening light turn the mountains gold and amber and then a deep, heavy blue. In the pasture, the turned earth was dark against the green, and the garden was planted. And somewhere down the ridge, the last of the infected were standing in the woods, still as statues, their bodies finally burning through the last of whatever unholy fuel had animated them. "Lily," I said, "when this is over, whatever over means, you don't have to be the one who fixes everyone." She leaned her head against the porch rail. "Neither do you," she said. The last of them stopped moving on May 29th. Nathan confirmed it on a long-range survey, a 5-mile loop through the surrounding hollows that took him and Roy 8 hours on foot. Every infected body they encountered was stationary. Not dead in the cinematic sense, there was no dramatic collapse, no final convulsion. They simply ceased. Standing, sitting, lying where they had last moved, their bodies spent, their mechanisms burned through. They were objects now. Terrible, pitiable objects, standing in fields and on roads and in the doorways of houses they had once lived in. The world did not announce its recovery. There was no broadcast, no all-clear signal, no helicopter passing overhead with a loudspeaker. The emergency ended the way it had begun, in increments, without ceremony, without a clear line between during and after. We began the expansion on June 1st. Glenn drew plans for 2 additional structures on the property, a communal kitchen and a storage building, using salvaged materials from abandoned houses in the hollow. Carl wired a small solar panel system from components Nathan retrieved on a long-range run to a hardware store in a town 12 miles east. The panel charged enough to power a radio and 2 lights. It was not much. It was everything. The garden broke soil in the 2nd week of June. Beans first, then squash. The tomatoes were slower, but Denise monitored them with the attentiveness of someone who understood that food growing from earth was not a convenience, but a covenant. People left. The Turners departed in mid-June, headed south toward Angela's family in Tennessee. They took enough supplies for a week. They took the car they'd arrived in. We did not hear from them again, but the absence of news was no longer the same as the presence of disaster. The world was larger again. Silence might mean distance rather than death. Janet and Bill Ramsey stayed. Their children had bonded with Marcus and Deshawn in the way that children bond under pressure completely, irrationally, with a loyalty that adults spend years trying to build and never quite manage. The 4 of them formed a unit that operated semi-independently within the larger group, building a fort in the hayloft, establishing rules, assigning roles. A society in miniature, assembled by people who were too young to know they were doing it. Glenn stayed. He had no one waiting for him anywhere. He had the property, and the property had become the thing he was building. And for an engineer, a project is a form of belonging. Denise stayed. Sophie, healthy now, grew fast in the mountain air and followed Lily everywhere with the devotion of someone who had imprinted on the first safe person she found after the worst thing that had ever happened to her. Roy stayed, though he slept in his truck for the first 3 weeks, claiming he preferred the privacy. Eventually, June convinced him to take one of the upstairs rooms. And I suspect she did this not through argument, but through the quiet, persistent warmth that June Harwood applied to loneliness, the way she applied it to everything, not as a fix, but as a presence. My mother called on June 22nd. I don't know how. The phone networks were barely functional, operating in sporadic bursts that no one could predict or control. The call lasted 90 seconds. She was alive. She was in West Virginia with Gerald. She asked if I was okay. I said I was. She said she would come when the roads were clear. I said okay. She said she loved me. I said okay again. I pressed end and put the phone down, and I did not cry, because the feeling inside me was not grief. It was something more complex and less dramatic, the recognition that the woman who had dropped me here had, through negligence or fate or something between the two, given me the only thing I needed and nothing else: the house, the bunker, the inheritance of a grandmother who built walls because love demanded them. That was enough. It was not everything. It was enough. I still sleep in the bunker sometimes, not because I need to. The house is safe now. The doors are reinforced, the windows fitted with shutters Glenn built from oak, the perimeter marked and maintained. The garden feeds us through summer and fall. The root cellar holds enough preserved food to bridge the winter. We are 23 now. 3 more arrived in July, following the road like Denise had, carrying nothing but themselves and the particular expression of people who have walked past things they will never describe. I sleep in the bunker because it is the closest I can get to my grandmother. The walls hold her labor. The ventilation system hums with the frequency of her refusal to let the world take what she loved. I lie on the bottom bunk and I press my hand against the concrete she poured. And I think about the letter she wrote, the test she described. The test will not be whether you survive. The test will be who you become in order to survive. I became the door, open when it should have been closed, closed when it should have been open, never perfectly calibrated, always choosing. I am 18 now. I am the grandmother of this house.